Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Tattershaw. I am Vice President of the ASMG group of companies. ASMG have aerospace and defense manufacturing capabilities in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Today, we would like to present an expert-based objective aerospace discussion on what's going on in China and the US and the issues that are affecting the North American aerospace industry by getting a better understanding of the Chinese aerospace market size and dynamics, the increased competition from Chinese aircraft manufacturers, and a look at the potential justification or issues that will affect your reshoring or offshoring decisions.
Firstly, please let me introduce you to the highly respected aerospace and defense expert Richard Aboulafia. Richard is Vice President of Analysis at the Teal Group. He manages consulting projects in the commercial and military aircraft field and analyzes broader defense and aerospace trends. He has advised numerous aerospace companies, including most prime and many second and third tier contractors in the US, Europe, and Asia. He also advises numerous financial institutions on aerospace market condition. Richard writes and edits the Teal Group's World Military and Civil Aircraft Briefing, a forecasting tool covering over 135 aircraft programs and markets. He also writes publicly about aviation and defense, with regular columns in Aviation Week and Space Technology and at Forbes.com. His articles have also appeared in Slate.com, The Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Professional Pilot, and many other publications. Secondly, please let me introduce you to Dr. Eamon McKinney. Dr. McKinney is an eminent sinologist who is widely regarded as one of the foremost authorities in the world on China-related business issues, including aerospace. He has been actively involved with China foreign business for more than 40 years and was instrumental in the first modern Sino-foreign joint venture in 1980. Since 1985, Dr. McKinney has advised hundreds of foreign companies on their China strategies, and those include Ford, GM, Caterpillar, Rolls-Royce, Eaton, Johnson Controls, Honeywell, Curtiss-Wright, and many others. He has authored 6 books on the subject and has contributed numerous articles to such publications as the Financial Times and Economist. Dr. McKinney and his team are on the ground in China and have a deep and unrivaled knowledge of the real critical situation and challenges. He will give us a rarely considered view relating to the Chinese aerospace industry. Welcome, Dr. McKinney and Richard Aboulafia.
So Richard and Dr. McKinney, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome.
My pleasure.
Our first question is for you, Dr. McKinney. Eamon, can you please tell me what the rarely considered real situation is in China and what other issues, especially relating, of course, to President Trump's executive order today, do you see that are contributing to your strong belief that North American aerospace companies should be taking seriously the emerging competition threat from the Chinese aircraft manufacturers like Comac, and also based on all of the issues that you've viewed in the past, should be reconsidering their China marketing and manufacturing strategies?
Oh, where to start with that? That's a big question. Well, China's commercial airplane producer is Comac. They're producing now a single-aisle, narrow-bodied C919 that's going to compete in the space of the Airbus 320 and the 737 MAX. The first ones have just rolled off the production line, some years late, but I'm not surprised about that. The Chinese will wait until they think they've got it right. But that is already a competitor. They have orders for about 100, which they think they can fill by the end of next year. Their current capacity is estimated to be between 50 and 100 planes a year, which obviously is fairly small change compared to the current duopoly. But they'll be able to scale up very, very quickly. The C919 is not going to be quite as sophisticated as the Airbus or Boeing alternatives, but it's going to be an awful lot cheaper.
I'm awfully sorry to interrupt. There are no plans to deliver a C919 this year, and realistically not next either. And the idea of delivering 100 anytime before, the middle of the decade, it's not on the cards at all. COMAC says that it can barely, maybe get it certified by the end of next year. And even that they're kind of waffling on. So we do a bunch of that. The production model now that they're starting to deliver after quite a few years is the ARJ-21 regional jet. It's the one that's just getting going. So awfully sorry to interrupt, but
No, not at all, as I said. But I mean, if we look at where the C919 is going to compete, I mean, and the Chinese model in many industries that I could give you parallels for, is they're going to come out with something that is not as good as what's there already. There's no doubt about that. But it's a lot cheaper. So that gives it the opportunity to compete in markets that Boeing and Airbus are just priced out of. If the C919 sells as projected at about $50 million, that means it's about half the price of the Airbus equivalent and about 60% less than the 737. The initial market for it, which no doubt will get certified fairly quickly once all the tests have been run, is going to be China, and it's got a huge capacity to soak up COMAC's capacity there. What the Chinese are very good at is executing, and when they're ready to scale up, they will be able to do that very, very, very quickly. Now, they're fully aware of what a complex undertaking that is, but don't ever underestimate China's ability to be able to execute. They'll be able to do that. If we're looking at plane itself as a competition to Boeing and Airbus, it's already that. You know, every order for the C919 is one that Boeing or Airbus don't get. So they're already competing in that space with future orders and that sort of thing. The interesting thing about COMAC is, where is its future market? As part of the Belt and Road Initiative, 130 countries have signed up willingly because, you know, they're presented with a win-win situation. Nobody's been coerced, nobody's been threatened. It's a win-win situation. So China has a great need for natural resources, ore and the other precursors for its manufacturing, foodstuffs. So it needs to be doing business with countries in Africa, countries in South America, other Southeast Asian countries that are not high GDP companies. So if you look at the model in Africa, for example, in Kenya, where they're building railroads, dams, ports, infrastructure that the country badly needs, it will allow them to get access to those raw materials and will allow that country to receive investment and infrastructure. So it's a win-win situation. Part of the Belt and Road Initiative is the maritime component, which is the string of pearls, which involves ports throughout Africa, the Middle East, South America. But another component of that is air travel. The maritime solution or even the rail solution isn't always the answer to developing a country and getting access to those resources. So the aviation aspect of that isn't being widely spoken about. Many of these countries need airplanes, and cost is an issue. But airplanes themselves on their own aren't any good. What they also need is what China is already the best in the world at, is airports. China's building 2 a week. It's just completed the largest airport in the world in Beijing. China's way of doing this would be to tie in the aviation aspect with the current Belt and Road Initiative, which would involve supplying airplanes, providing the servicing capability, and building the airports as well. And again, they're going to be able to do that at a cost that nobody else is going to compete with. So in isolation, the C19 can be spoken about as a less than perfect competitor to Boeing and Airbus. But with their cost structure, if we look at what they're able to do with that to tie into the Belt and Road Initiative, it's dynamic, it's a game changer.
So how do you feel, Eamon, about the announcement today about the executive order from President Trump?
Well, that's an escalation, there's no doubt about it. When we're talking about the aerospace sector in particular, what we've been seeing in China for the last several months are articles, blogs, opinion pieces from leading academics and commentators that's questioning why China is allowing American aerospace and defense contractors to be benefiting from Chinese manufacturing, in the light of all the current hostility towards it. A good question, in fact. So being able to read the tea leaves, when you see that sort of thing that's being published in the mainstream Chinese media over here, it's with the consent of the government. So this has been an area of some concern for several months. The Taiwan issue, where it's in retaliation to America selling $5 billion worth of arms to Taiwan, enforcing the sanction Boeing Defense, Raytheon, and Lockheed, I beg your pardon. What that would mean is, following again the American model, that they would sanction anybody that's doing business with those countries. The recent development is now extended, because essentially what Trump has said is anybody doing business with anybody connected to Chinese military, and you could make a case that that could be anybody, is liable to sanctions, currency controls, and they're not going to be able to have any listing or any investment. So again, the details at this very early stage are vague. But if China responds in kind, as fully expected to do, that will mean sanctioning any company that's got any connection in China to the American defense industry. It's okay. Stroke aerospace. Yeah. So this is a worrying situation. It's a major escalation, and China will retaliate. Again, this is breaking news, so a lot of the details are still sketchy, but China's going to become a very uncomfortable place for American aerospace companies, especially those that have got strong ties to the defense industry. That's the situation as we understand it at the moment, Mark.
Okay, Eamon, absolutely. Richard, obviously, this is breaking news, and we'd like to get your perspective on this news, and also, please, on the actual Chinese aerospace industry and marketplace as well. So if you could please give us some background information. Obviously, there's been a lot of investment. There's a lot of reliance on the supply chain, on the commercial aerospace side of things in China. Boeing, Airbus, Bombardier, lots of other companies as well. Where do you think it is, and where is it going, Richard, please?
Well, the Chinese have been attempting to build an aircraft industry since the Mao days. Originally, it was closely allied with the old Soviet model of aerospace production and design. Gradually, it's moved. Now it's completely towards the West. As recently as the early 1990s, the most commonly used jetliner in China was the Tupolev 154, and now I don't think there are any old Soviet planes left over there. But what has emerged is an industry that is still completely dependent upon the West. Yes, they do have a regional jet that they've just delivered the 23rd aircraft after 20 years of trying. The C919 should enter service in a couple of years, maybe 929 a few years after that. But all of them have one thing in common, the 919 and ARJ21. They cannot get off the ground without a very high level of Western content. Literally, it would not be physically possible. And of course, the engines, the avionics, all of the components that make these things functioning airplanes are the products of joint ventures between Western aerospace companies and Chinese equivalents, mostly under the AVIC umbrella. So there are many questions in this retaliatory pattern that Dr. Eamon talks about. It was just a little bit earlier in the Trump administration that the US government was about to stop giving permission to General Electric for providing the engines to the C919. Trump overruled that. Sort of an interesting development. And now we've got this, and it raises the big question, do the sorts of joint ventures set up between AVIC and the Western component suppliers constitute investment? How will that be interpreted? And of course, the even bigger question, what happens in 70 days or so with the Biden administration? Do they double down on that? Do they clarify that? There's so much uncertainty that Western companies have to deal with. And quite frankly, so do the Chinese, because again, it's going to be at least, if there were a crash program implemented today, maybe, just maybe, COMAC could get going by the end of the decade with a truly indigenous jetliner. Until then, they're heavily dependent upon those Western inputs to make these planes fly. And that crash program would have to be a remarkable achievement. You know, it took the Soviets a very long time. So this is going to be fascinating to watch.
Oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate that, Richard. Could you give us some more background information, please, and present to us?
Well, of course. You know, one of the big questions concerns the neutrality associated with Chinese airlines, whether they'll have purchasing autonomy. And in the broader context of what's happening in China, I think Dr. Eamon would say they're having less autonomy. The government is reasserting itself, and that's going to color things. But I'd like you to quickly walk you through a few charts that speak to Chinese market and aerospace industry situation, if you wouldn't mind. Next page, please. You know, first of all, looking at the macroeconomics of China, as I'm sure Dr. Eamon is there on the ground, GDP growth in China has, of course, fallen off a bit in recent years, nominally 6.1%, I believe, in 2019. Everyone is focused upon the rather miraculous recent quarter, which achieved 4.9%, which has been fantastic. But of course, you're coming out of a deep valley of the early part of 2020. It's also important to remember that an awful lot of China's GDP growth in recent years has been accompanied by a significant debt run-up, and we have no doubts, at least I certainly don't have any doubts, that that's what's going on here. Now, I mentioned the GDP issue because there's an important factor. For many years, Chinese air travel growth followed the developing model pattern of roughly a 2.0 multiplier of GDP growth to revenue passenger kilometer growth. In other words, as the economy grew, the level of traffic growth in the airline industry was roughly twice that. So for example, in 2018, air travel growth was 12.2%, utterly perfect, fell completely in line with the 6.1% GDP growth. What happened in 2019, before the pandemic, was a significant downshift in the aviation industry in China. Indeed, by the end of 2019, air travel growth had fallen to just 5.3% year over year, which means they're either lying about numbers or there has been a break in the historical pattern of that relationship between economic growth. And it's starting to show up in aircraft demand numbers too, as you'll see in a moment. So the broader macroeconomic context, I think, is important. Next page, please. Meanwhile, as I'm sure you've seen these numbers too, we've got decoupling happening, and it's all too real. Not only is the economy softening in both our world and their world, and air travel in China has softened pre-pandemic, but obviously foreign direct investment between China and the US has fallen off markedly as well. Next page, please. Now, I mentioned that air travel demand had fallen off in 2019. So did the country's imports of Western jetliners. You can see, though, for the past couple of decades, it's been a remarkable story. Of all the BRIC countries, it's really just China that matters. And in 2000, China, well, it represented a mere 2% of the world market. That wasn't appreciably different than 5 or 10 years before that. But after 2000, it was kind of a straight ride up. Even you look at the world post-2001 recession and the jetliner demand downturn that followed it, China was a key part in lifting the jetliner industries out of that in the middle 2000s. And then they just kept going. And by 2018, China represented a remarkable 23% of the world market, the biggest export market by far, tied with the US for the biggest market, period, for jetliners. So China was really coming into its own. And then 2019 happened. Again, can't quite figure it out, but that connection between GDP and air travel broke, and jetliner imports fell along with that reduction in air travel demand too. So something happened in 2019. As we come out of the pandemic, it's going to be fascinating to watch China's recovery not just in terms of its GDP growth, but also in terms of air travel demand and in terms of, well, how many jets it takes. Next page, please. Here's that percentage, deliveries relative to total world percent, and just such a remarkable story followed by a rather inexplicable 2019. Well, it is somewhat explicable. Part of it might just be that, GDP disconnect. Part of it is attributable to delays with the 737 MAX program. The troubling thing is that intake of Airbus A320s also fell off in 2019. And that happened at a time when Airbus was actually trying to ramp up production of its Tianjin final assembly and checkout facility for the A320. So again, something happened in China's aviation market last year that I think we haven't completely understood just yet. Next page, please. Now, in terms of China's industrial role, this is a remarkable story. This is the OECD database looking at intermediate goods, so not finished products. If you were to look at finished products, which means aircraft and engines, final use products, you'd see really nothing here. It wouldn't even be registerable to the naked eye. But in terms of their role of intermediate goods, that's everything from bits and pieces to componentry to whatever, it's been very substantial growth over the past 5 years. We don't have 2019 numbers yet, but it looks like they were pretty decent too. But the second half of the 2010s showed the net effects of very considerable investments made by Western aerospace manufacturers in China. Next page, please. Now, however, of course, that growth has been plateauing in recent years. And 2019 might be higher, might be a little higher. We don't quite know just yet, but I'll bet you'll see a continuation of that plateau effect. So it could be that the great boom years are behind us. And certainly that Rhodium Group index of foreign direct investment between the US and China, that too speaks to the great days of aerospace industry growth in China fueled by Western investment basically being in the rearview mirror at this point and possibly in danger of reversal. Next page, please. Here's the US trade balance in aerospace with China. We have the best numbers for the US, of course, courtesy of the US ITC. And you can see of the 6 billion or so in intermediate goods that China was shipping out by way of aerospace, only about 1.6 was going to the US. The rest was going to, well, everywhere from Europe to Canada to Japan to wherever else. You can also see the impact of Boeing and General Electric shipments with the exports to China. And in 2018, I believe the ratio of the trade balance in aerospace was 17-1. That was remarkable. And of course, it reflected the fact that aerospace was far and away the US's strongest manufactured industry. However, of course, there you have it again in 2019, a remarkable downshift in what China was taking. So this is the broader context. And we're looking at a time in conclusion when we're not sure about Chinese growth returning to the great days that it was. We're not sure that China will return to the remarkable numbers of jets required. It probably will, but we just don't know. And most of all, we don't know where Western investment in Chinese aerospace is going. And certainly today's news adds yet another big question mark to that last issue.
Well, thank you for that, Richard. Absolutely fascinating information. Eamon, you've helped around 250 Western companies set up their manufacturing facilities and related projects in China, including a significant amount of US ones. You are now advising many of them, in many cases, based on lots of different factors, including cost, to consider reshoring or nearshoring. Apart from the Chinese-driven sort of decoupling of the relationships with US and US aerospace companies, in your opinion, what other key factors are driving this somewhat radical recommendation?
Well, the reshoring, particularly where we're talking about aerospace products, as both you and Richard well know, has been going on for some time. This is pre-COVID, pre-Trump, pre-tariffs, pre-hostility, if you like. And the reasons are purely financial. Costs have risen tremendously in China. China no longer confers the automatic price advantage that we assumed it had 5 or 10 years ago. So the reshoring initiative has been going on for some time. And basically it's, if a company sourcing from China and they go through a proper, total cost of ownership study, benchmark it against nearshored alternatives, they'll find that the business case for doing business with China financially is not necessarily there anymore, because there's a lot of other factors that go into that. So that's been a trend. And I know you guys at ASMG benefited from that mightily over the last couple of years. What we're seeing now, obviously, with this new rhetoric, is it's taken on a new level of urgency. The recent tariffs and sanctions that's going backwards and forwards does not bode well for the industry there. And China is going to become a very uncomfortable place for American aerospace companies in the coming months. And I don't see that changing regardless who's in the White House. So my advice, I don't advise anybody to reshore. What I advise them to do is to look hard again at the total cost that's involved in this. That's about where it is at the moment. It's not good. It's not good. The whole thing is actually pretty sad. There are a lot of good relationships have been going on for a long time. They're now being broken up. And we've been doing a lot of that over the last couple of months. And it's sad, and it's not benefiting either side. In fact, it's hurting both sides. But from the American perspective, if you're sourcing from China aerospace parts, it's fair to assume that that's coming to an end.
Thank you, Eamon. Appreciate your opinion. Richard, where do you see, with everything going on, with all of the factors that we've touched on, where do you see, especially for the next few years, the Chinese aerospace market and also the relationships with US companies and Chinese companies and sourcing from China, etc.? Basically, where do you see things going from here, please?
Well, like Eamon says, it's really hard to be optimistic. But having said that, there are some key differences between our industry and others. I mean, as decoupling takes place, we are going to be the last ones kicking and screaming to be decoupled. And that's not because of any sentimentality. That's largely because duration of everything is so much longer in aerospace, whether it's technology development, whether it's plant investment, whether it's product life cycles, whether it's the contracts themselves. Very often, their life of program, risk sharing partnerships. It's really, really hard to break off these kinds of relationships. There's a lot of discretionary sourcing that I expect will fall under the microscope very quickly. As Eamon says, that's happening right before our eyes, and that's regrettable because this trade relationship works extremely well for producers over here. I would say it's more than just driven by a reconsideration of costs due to manufacturing input inflation. It's also concerns about intellectual property. It's also the fact that in aerospace, there's no such thing as non-dual use. Everything is dual use. So there's always the risk that if there is an administration clampdown, again, as Eamon says, probably no matter who's in the White House, if there is an administration doubling down on the no dual use policy, it's going to be really, really tough to sort out what is dual use. Whether it's, it's obviously you get into some of the advanced metals, and it's the lifeblood of commercial that can also be adapted for military use, especially when you get into components like turbine engines and whatever else. However, having said all that, it's important to remember that China is an enormous market and it has no alternative. There is literally no alternative. Even back 20 years ago, I could have said, oh yes, well, the Russians, they could provide some of China's needs. The Russians can't do that anymore. They just no longer have that industry. About the worst thing I could imagine, though, is for the Chinese to say, well, we're going to coast on what we've got. We're going to buy up as many used aircraft, and indeed they hold a very strong position in financing Western jets. So it could be they simply bring more of them back home and throttle back on purchasing new ones. I don't regard that as being in their best interest. And similarly, I think there are people who would like to dissolve the joint ventures that have been established to create the necessary components, the brains and the muscle of indigenous Chinese jets, but they're just not ready for that either. For basically this decade, we are in a bad marriage where, as they say, divorce is probably not an option. So there will be aspects of it that do involve reshoring and decoupling, but I'm thinking that we're going to be the last part of the economy that's meaningfully coupled.
I would agree with that entirely. Some companies, it's easier to decouple if it's just sourcing, but companies that are heavily invested and integrated over there, that's going to be a very difficult situation for them. And all we can do, I think, at this stage is to keep watching the news. But I'll tell you, there's two very different versions of the facts. There's the very much American-centric version of events that's coming through the mainstream media over there, regardless of their left or right affiliation. And then there's the sentiment within China. And so many American companies are looking at this and considering reshoring and taking their time and acting as if that decision is going to be theirs alone. It isn't. I mean, I can cite over the course of the last couple of months 3 major cases where the Chinese side, who've been supplying American manufacturers, have said, you know, we'll fulfill the current orders, but no more. You know, love doing business with you, but we just don't see a future in it. It's very unpopular now. That's where we're at. I agree with you entirely. Of all the sectors that we're looking at, in fact, decoupling this sector is likely to be the most complex for many different reasons. So it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be a very interesting next couple of months, whatever happens.
For sure.
And I don't know how you keep up with it all, Richard. My hat goes off to you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it's the most dynamic part of the aviation industry. It's been the fastest growth. You know, whenever we've had a conversation in this industry about increasing output on single aisles, up to the pandemic, of course, it has effectively been a conversation about China's marginal ability to take more of these jets. You know, I've been in this business almost as long as you've been in China. I mean, 33 years. And for about more than half of that, this has been a conversation about China when it comes to commercial market growth.
Well, I tell you, this is intriguing, and I really appreciate it. You know, you guys have, obviously got some expert opinions. The relationships are deteriorating very quickly across the board. Today's announcement by President Trump may well accelerate that deterioration. And yeah, the situation is not good. So it's certainly going to generate some real discussion and a lot of thought. So I think this is a good time. Thank you, gentlemen, to close out the discussion. Our expert panelists here, Dr. Eamon McKinney, and from the Teal Group, Richard Aboulafia. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk with us today. Again, very interesting times, and I hope the viewers found this podcast interesting and informative. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more discussion on these subject topics going forward. So thank you again, Richard. Thank you again, Eamon.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.